All right, folks, we're going to get started here pretty soon. Hopefully the people on the webinar can hear us. I'm going to take a quick moment and ask somebody to just verify that we're coming through and that we can hear you. So if you're online, you should have to push *6 to unmute yourself and then just say hello. Hear us? All right, was that someone? Maybe not. I didn't hear anyone. Hopefully, someone
Hello.
We're getting like just a little touch of somebody. I don't know if they're cutting in and out on a cell phone or something.
I can hear you.
Oh, excellent. Fantastic. All right, we're all set up for the webinar then. This workshop is on multiple operations. A couple of logistics for those who are participating online. The audio call-in number is at the bottom. It'll be repeated on a number of slides. If you want to speak, just hit the little hand button to raise your hand, and we'll get to you. You'll have to hit *6 to unmute yourself, and then when you're finished speaking, just hit *6 again so we don't get a lot of background noise. For those in the room, again, this will be a repeat from this morning, but restrooms are out the door to your left, all the way to the end to your left again. There's a cafeteria downstairs. If there is an emergency or a drill, we have to evacuate. We'll go down the stairs, out the front doors, and to the Cesar Chavez Park kitty corner. Find one of us, and we will leave. Like I said, this is multiple operations. We'll go over a few opening remarks about 901 and the process, review the major topics that we have identified after the last two sets of informal workshops, as well as the written comments that we've received. We'll have also opportunity for open discussion and other questions that you might have that aren't on that list. So feel free to just bring up any questions or comments that apply to the topic, and we'll discuss them. And then at the end, I'll take the last 5 minutes or so and just go over next steps, what we're up to next, and what you can expect. That being said, 901, and again, for those who've been on these workshops, this is going to be very repetitious, but I just want to give a brief overview. 901 was really the legislature's answer to the increasing difficulty that CalRecycle will be facing as we move from our 50% diversion mandate to our 75% diversion mandate by 2020. A lot of what we've done so far has been great work, but it's the easiest parts have been done first. And as we get more and more of the system under control and sort of projects and programs in place for them, the remaining pieces are harder and harder for us to get at and influence and impact. And in order to do that, we really need to understand how those systems work, how the infrastructure works across the state, both for solid waste as well as recycling and composting. And without that information, we really don't have much of a chance of being able to effectively influence that. So the legislature came up with AB 901 to require additional reporting so that CalRecycle could get the information that we need in order to effectively allocate our resources, whether it be our market development groups or our grant programs, loan programs, or other programs that we do here at CalRecycle to move us from 50% to 75%. There are also a number of aspects of 901 that were just to improve data quality and the timeliness of the reporting, including requiring online reporting and cutting out some of the steps of the reporting, specifically from facilities to counties and then counties to CalRecycle. 901 mandates reporting directly from the facilities department. A little bit about the timeline. We're finishing up the informal process now with these workshops. We're hoping that this will sort of signal the end of the informal process, and then we'll move into the formal rulemaking process, which is governed by the Office of Administrative Law. That process takes about a year. Depending on the nature of the comments and revisions that are made. and provides a fair amount of opportunity for public involvement, a number of opportunities during that process. Where if we are able to start the formal rulemaking process this fall, we're hoping to finish sort of towards the end of 2017. And at the same time, we'll be developing our online reporting tool to be finished around the same time, towards the end of 2017, in time for our hoped first reporting period of the first quarter of 2018. That being said, I'm going to go over briefly the major topics that we identified from both verbal and written comments from the last sets of workshop on this topic, multiple operations. Also sort of referred to this variously as vertically integrated operations, but we're talking about operations where the material is generated, processed, and used all on the same site, or operations where the material is generated and processed on the site, but it's shipped off-site for use someplace else, or operations when the material is generated off-site, sorry for the typo here, but it's processed and used on the same site. We have single companies that participate in multiple steps, and we've talked about this at a couple of the other workshops briefly, but you may well have operations that's a transfer station that also operates as a hauler, or you're a recycling operation that also has a hauling company that does some hauling. You might be a processor and an end user, and how do those operations fit into the reporting scheme? And then lastly, if you have recycling operations or composting operations on the same site as a disposal facility, and how those fit in. And before we jump in, I'll just say that the statute for 901 does provide for what is calling aggregated reporting for recycling and composting operations on the same site. And what we're interpreting that to mean, and one of the biggest examples is say a chip and grind and a compost facility. Oftentimes these sites are co-located. They might be owned by the same company, they might be owned by separate companies under the same corporate umbrella. It really doesn't matter. But that chip and grind facility may send some of their material to offsite for use as mulch or other purposes, and they might send some of that chipped and grind organic material to the compost facility on site. And the statute provides an opportunity to aggregate the reporting for that entire operation. So you wouldn't report the flow between the chip and grind to the compost facility. So that facility would show chipped material leaving for mulch or wherever it's going off-site, and it would show compost going off-site for end use, but it wouldn't show mulch going from chip and grind to the compost if they're on the same site. However, that does not pertain to facilities that have recycling and disposal co-located. Section 4 recycling and composting only. So if you have a, say, landfill that has a compost facility on site for some reason, and they're sending some of the organic material that they get at the landfill over to the compost facility, that flow would have to be reported discretely because there is no ability for aggregated reporting between composting recycling facilities and a co-located disposal facility. So that all being said, as a little bit of background, I want to talk a little bit about what kinds of facilities are engaged in these kinds of multi-tiered operations where they're vertically integrated like this, which of these first three bullets maybe are common versus rare, maybe they're all common, and how we think these should be addressed. What we're sort of initially thinking is that each operation is sort of addressed separately. So if you're a transfer station that has a hauling company sort of associated with it, whether it's the same name or a different name, there's no difference. But if you do some of your own private hauling to your facility and some other facilities, that they're sort of dealt with separately. So you look at your operations as a hauling company and look to determine whether you have a reporting obligation as a hauler, and you make that determination. And then you look at your operations as a transfer station and determine whether you have a reporting obligation as a transfer station and report accordingly. And the same thing for if you're a processor or a MRF or a compost facility or an end user. all of these operations sort of looked at individually. Do I have a reporting obligation for this activity as a hauler, as a transfer station, as a landfill, as a compost facility? And then you can determine whether or not you have to report them as discrete operations because one's a landfill and one's a composting operation, or if you have the opportunity to combine them into a single report, meaning you don't have to report the flows in between operations within or activities within a single operation. So with that, I'd like to open it up to the group to get some insight on what's going on in this area, some concerns that people have that maybe they're operating facilities like this and they're not sure how they might fit into things, or maybe there are considerations that we haven't thought of related to vertically integrated operations or operations that have multiple activities on site that we should consider. Again, the folks online, just hit your little hand button, and then we'll call on you when we have some time. Does anybody have any initial thoughts? Go ahead. I don't think, is it?
All right.
There you go.
Yeah. Hi, Tim Dewey Mattia, Napa Recycling and Waste Services. So we're a hauler, a composter, a MRF. We have a transfer station. So we have we fit into this multiple operation, I guess the fourth bullet. So I think my kind of thoughts are sort of on allocations and the mess that we can get into with multiple allocations. I think we have a good handle on inbound material at our facility and origins and tons. But when we talk about outbound, and you think about as a composter and a recycler and a MRF, different residual and different products that we're selling, trying to tie that to the inbound, and then that was a concern, was because we look at allocations of inbound and different allocations depending on the material type, and then how much we really try to drill down into that and how much we just get cost in multiple allocations. So if we're a multiple operation, maybe we can have a simplified allocation for certain things, just to kind of keep that from just us going through this problem that was mentioned before of having an error in a spreadsheet that just perpetuates through the whole thing. So I think that's because as a multiple operation, we have some advantages in that we have a good sense of what we're hauling and what we're processing. But when we start to try to break out tons outbound into where they came from, that's where it's not something we currently do, and we're a little bit concerned about it becoming a mess.
Great, thank you for that. So when you're talking about allocation, I think you're talking about assigning jurisdiction of origin and source sector for materials sent to a landfill.
Or even for materials that we market, because each one's going to have different breakdown of where it came from, whether it's compost or whether it's wood chips or whether it's plastic.
Right, so materials that are recycling materials, composting materials that you're marketing and sending off for either further processing or to an end use, there is no jurisdiction of origin associated with those materials, with those flows. So when you send off compost, you will never have to assign jurisdiction of origin for that compost. But if in the process of making that compost, you screen out some amount of contamination, depending on how much contamination, and we talked a little bit about this during the thresholds discussion, and we'll talk more about it during the jurisdiction of origin and source sector estimation later, you may or may not need to pass on jurisdiction of origin information on the residuals that leave your facility to go to a landfill. But certainly not for your cardboard, not for your aluminum, not for your plastics, not for your compost, not for your chipped and grind mulch. None of that will have jurisdiction of origin or source sector associated with it. So hopefully that alleviates some of the concern. And then again, we'll talk more about reasonable methodologies for estimating jurisdiction of origin and source sector and allocating those from a facility when we get to the workshop on jurisdiction of origin and source sector estimations. But thank you for the comment. And we got Brian.
Imagine that. So I was a little confused by a comment that you made that reports could be aggregated for composting and recycling facilities, but not for disposal facilities. And the way I read the statute under 41821.5, 3, it says the information report submitted pursuant to the subdivision may be provided to the department on an aggregated facility-wide basis. It doesn't specify recycling or composting facility.
Right, that's
So-
under subsection B, which refers to recycling and composting operations. Subsection A refers to disposal facilities. And so that's why that
Oh, B1, 2,
specifically
3.
refers to the recycling and composting operations, but not landfills or disposal operations.
My bad not reading that.
Well, that's all right. I know
yeah.
it can be tough to get all the interdependencies of the
Yeah.
subsections.
So on this bullet list up here, it would seem that the first bullet, why would it even be included? Because
The moment we're anticipating them not being included.
okay.
As the current writing of the regulations, they are not in.
Yeah, it wouldn't be
Not
solid waste to
reporting
begin with. It wouldn't be something that was recycled. It wouldn't have been counted to begin with. So why bother?
They're currently excluded from reporting obligation, but we wanted to include everything so that we had an opportunity to talk to people in case they didn't necessarily agree with that.
Right. So where a company like Republic or Waste Management or somebody else, and if they're here, Chuck's here, but I think that if there should be an exemption that if a solid waste facility is also a hauler, then the exemption would be if you're both, then it's the facility does the reporting. Instead of having, well, my trucks came in and reported, it's the same entity. Have them have the disposal facility report or have it an aggregation of that so that you don't have double reports. Well, my hauling division did this and my, transfer station division did this. It just would get really, it seems like it'd be burdensome to apply that extra layer to them. If they're separate, if they're, hauling to doing operations in a different jurisdiction, for example, where they're not delivering it to their own facility or transporting it from their own facility, then they should report because then they're otherwise not being tracked.
Right. So generally speaking, haulers don't have a reporting obligation directly to CalRecycle across the board. There are some circumstances, notably if they're picking up directly from a generator and going to an out-of-state facility, then they have to report. And the other is if they're picking up directly from a generator and going directly to an end user. But if they're going to a landfill or a MRF or a transfer station or a processor or anything like that, there is no obligation to report to CalRecycle. They may have to report some information to the facility that they're dropping the material off at, but there wouldn't be an additional requirement for them to report that flow to CalRecycle. That being said, most of the material that would be leaving, say, a landfill to another facility would be reported by the landfill as a facility, but the hauler, that transporter, what we're calling a transporter under the regs, from facility to facility wouldn't also not have a reporting obligation. So I think that what you're concerned about is probably has already been addressed, that there won't be an obligation for, say, Waste Management who operates a landfill to report what they put in the hole as landfill, plus all the material that they're hauling to some transfer station 2 jurisdictions over, because they don't have to report that anyway. They would only report to the landfill that they're dropping it off at, or the transfer station that they're dropping that material off at. When they drop off the material, they drive into the gate, they have to tell them some information about where it came from, just like any hauler would.
How does that fit with the third bullet then? I guess that's probably where my confusion's coming from.
So this
Generated
would be-
offsite, processed onsite, but it's the same company.
Right, so if it's generated off-site, and so in this example, we're talking about recycling or composting, because you don't use material for disposal. So for processing and for use, that we're just talking about recycling and composting. So this example would include something like, I don't know, a farm purchasing straw from off-site to make compost on their property and then apply it to their crops. Or we've heard maybe asphalt companies who have asphalt brought from some street someplace to their facility. They grind it up, they mix it with binders and other additives, turn it into asphalt, and make a product that can be used. So they're the processor and the end user. but it's being generated off-site. Again, the hauler doesn't have a reporting obligation. So the first reporter would be the processor. I received this straw for composting, or I received this asphalt for processing. But again, I only report what I send out, right? So not what comes in. I'm not saying I bought 100 tons of straw, or I had 1,000 tons of asphalt brought to my facility. I, as a processor, say what left. It's just that the left is to an end user that's the same as the processor. So I would say that for an end use, and it happened to be on the same property. That's at least the structure as we envision it currently. Folks have examples of situations where that's what's happening. I mean, we've heard it from the pavement group for sure, that happens a lot. But go ahead, if you grab a mic just to your right there. Give it a second, I think. Little button sort of on the bottom on the side. Another mic, maybe we can pass it. I doubt the people that are online can hear you because they're rather far.
All right. My name is Alberto Ramirez. I work for Tiger Material and Construction. And, following what you were saying about companies that receive concrete and asphalt, yes, we do receive asphalt from multiple sources that sometimes we don't even know where they're coming from. And we process the asphalt. The asphalt that goes back out as product, you cannot put 100% of the asphalt that you receive back out as a product. It usually is feed into brand new asphalt about maybe, I will say, 5%, 7%. And the same thing goes with concrete. Concrete will come in, you crush it. Concrete that has rebar, we save the steel, and then we also sell the steel, to the steel manufacturers. So on that saying, are we going to have to report what goes out then?
About correct.
Okay.
So in the example that you just gave, you would essentially report 500 tons of steel went off-site for recycling because you send it to some steel recycler, I presume. And then you would also report, 1,000 tons of asphalt to end use. The end user would be yourself because
that's right.
You're the end user as well, but you just say that it goes to end use. Whether we have an opportunity to differentiate between an off-site end use and an on-site end use, I think would probably be what we end up going for. So you would basically just say X tons of asphalt to end use on site. And then you'd be done. Your steel is reported as going out for recycling. Your asphalt is going to an end use on site, and that would be it.
I have a question about this, particularly for a regrinder. This is Brian again. Why is CalRecycle interested in trying to cast a broad net for material that never enters the waste stream to begin with? So if somebody's grinding up Highway 5 that goes across multiple jurisdictions and it's going to T-Kurt or to one of these big construction outfits, it gets reground, puts back into the asphalt and back on the highway. It never was in the solid waste stream. It was never intended to go to landfill. It didn't go to landfill. It's not part of your 75% diversion. And so the fact that they're recycling it seems like that's the ideal system.
I think it is a very, very good system. I think a lot of the recycling streams are good systems, but we don't necessarily want to exempt all of the good, well-operating recycling streams in the state. But to answer your question, we don't want to just understand what is currently going into the landfill, but rather we want to understand the disposal, which is what we have been tracking for some time under the original DRS. But the purpose, or one of the purposes of 901, is to expand the world of what we're looking at and the data that we're getting, to include the whole recycling and composting streams as well as the disposal stream. So to that end, we're looking at all of the recycling infrastructure in the state, even the ones that are working very well and are doing a really good job of keeping material from entering the landfill now. And one of the things that, we talk about a lot is that materials and markets change over time. And while there may well be, a great, robust, almost seemingly never-ending market for crushed asphalt, for example, now, that might not be the case in 10 years or in 15 years or in 20 years. We're seeing a lot of changes in the global commodity markets now, that materials that had unlimited opportunities that almost never made it into the landfills are being collected, sorted, baled, and then thrown in a landfill because there's literally no market for them. So things change, and we want to understand how the system is working, even if it's working well, so that if things start to change in the future and they work less well, that we know what's going on and we have an opportunity to not be blindsided by huge upsets in the market that we know nothing about. So that's why we're trying to capture things that may seem like they're sort of taking care of themselves already. The first bullet, the generated, processed, and used on site stream, is one that we agree sort of on that level, that these materials are never entering even the recycling or composting system, really. They're just being handled on site, whether it be, an orchard composting their own trimmings, or it's, you're grinding up a concrete sidewalk and just dumping it right behind the machine to be compacted so that the new concrete can be poured over the top of it. That's all just sort of reused on site or processed and used on site. That's never entering the stream. But if it is coming off site and being processed at a different facility, or if it's being processed and then shipped off someplace else for use, that's part of the recycling, composting, and or solid waste infrastructure in general, and as a flow, as a piece that we feel is important for us to understand about.
Has CalRecycle looked at the implication of this broader, kind of expansive? I mean, in a sense, you're looking at every auto dismantler, every, rock quarry that takes in material and recrushes it and sends it back out again, every, it's really a much more expansive than what I think was originally intended when we were starting on this path, which is to identify the material that is waste and what was waste or could be waste, and not try to get every piece of material that could be considered recycled at one point in time, even though it's not.
Yeah, I'd actually say that given the language in 901, that the language in 901 is much more expansive than what our regulations are currently envisioning, and that's generally the way things go, right? I mean, the statute gives you the broad authority, and then regulations narrow things down and clarify and specify, which is what we're doing. I think 901, in the way it's written, it says recycling and composting. So anything to do with recycling or composting is in. And we are now trying to tease out the things that don't necessarily always make sense to be included, pulling out areas that we think can be pulled out of the system. So I think, again, that the statute provides a broad authority for pretty much everything, and we're in the process of teasing out the things that we want to kick out of the reporting system.
I'm John Sitz with CalRecycle again. Part of this regulatory process is always going to be drawing the boundaries of where the reporting starts and ends. And we have some general things in the regs, like usually generators are out and end users are out. But there are areas where, none of this is written in stone. we can look through and say, make an argument for why something should be in or out, and we can look at, well, how does this relate to other facilities? How does this relate to the system overall? And we can look on a case-by-case thing at different areas. As Robert said, though, recycling and composting is pretty broad. So, but specifics about, which situations should we just clearly exclude, like the asphalt machine that pulls up the road, recycles it, puts it right back down. Clearly, we want that out. And those type of situations, if you can identify those, we can say, yeah, these are all ones that don't have to report, and we can narrow that field. Because obviously we don't know everything that's happening out there. Or if there's broader classes that's like, well, anything that acts like this we think should be out. Well, explain it to us and suggest what those categories would be.
We have Carol Parker with a raised hand. Carol, did you have a question? You can press *6 to unmute your line. Well, while we wait for Carol, if she still has a question, there's also a question from Carlos Chavez. My agency owns and operates a transfer station, a recycling center, and a hazardous waste facility. These facilities are all located on the same lot, and materials flow between them daily. Would this material flow count as outgoing and require reporting?
Great. So for the most part, I think those entities, depending on what they're doing exactly, but they probably, the activities that we're talking about, materials flowing between the transfer station and HHW facility and those would all be counted as recycling activities, even though they might also send off material to a landfill for disposal. What they're doing, those transfers are a part of the recycling activities, and so they would be able to be captured under this aggregating. So if you get some material into your HHW facility, for instance, that's not HHW, and maybe you just got a bunch of jars in a plastic bucket, and you want to send the plastic bucket to the other side of the internal road to be recycled with the rest of your plastic, then that is not a flow that you would have to report. You would report just the outgoing from the whole facility, rather than all of the intermediate transfers and flows in between the sections within that facility. We have Carol. I guess not.
Hello?
Oh, there you go. Great. What's your question?
I was just wondering, is the status of dirt going to change in these regs? Are we going to have to start tracking it as it leaves a construction site or goes to a construction site or goes to an engineered fill or whatever?
So I am actually going to pass this right on over to John because he's a lot more tied into what's been done historically with soil, contaminated soil or clean soil. So I'll let him give some background and thoughts on that.
Yeah, traditionally in the disposal reporting system, soil is not something that's reported on. People report on disposal, and then they report on alternative daily cover, alternative intermediate cover, and such. But because the soil, even if it's contaminated soil that's been brought up to not be too contaminated, is just considered cover or daily cover, intermediate cover. So those are not separate things that they have to report to us, like jurisdiction of origin or anything like that. I think they do have to put a line in on the Board of Equalization form about how much soil, but that's not really an issue that we're covering in this.
Does that answer your question? All right, perhaps she's muted herself. I think we had a follow-up online, and then we have a couple of hands raised here in the room as well.
Does the Form 303 report relieve my hazardous waste facility from reporting target materials such as paint and batteries?
Some of that's still up for discussion during the materials workshop, but I would say no. The information being requested under 303 and the information that 901 requires are not the same. And while there is some overlap, it's not enough, in my opinion, to justify the fact that the 303 information replaces the 901 obligation. For the most part, it's because the main focus of 901 is to understand flow, not only magnitude but direction of that flow. And direction specifically is something that is left out on the 303 reporting. And there's even a bit more aggregation for 303 reporting, so it's not facility by facility, but it's jurisdiction. So for me, at the moment, without having benefit of having the conversation during the materials workshop later, I would say 303 does not serve as a good replacement for 901. However, it is possible that we might be able to make a system in place so that it could run the other direction, because I think the 901 data is more than the 303 data. And so we might be able to have the data provided through 901 port over into 303 so that it's still only reported once. But we'd have to have a conversation with our IT department to see whether that kind of interconnectedness is possible. But anyway, we'll talk more about that when we get into our materials and products discussion. And we had a couple in the room. I saw over here, and then Larry also had a question. Just say your name and where you're from for the group.
Tom Davis, Davis Consulting Service, Orange County. I was hoping, Robert, that you could give a couple more examples of how you define under bullet point 3 used on site.
Well, I hate to do this, but I was hoping you could give me some more examples. So these are situations that we've heard some thought about. Some folks have identified areas where these might pose unique circumstances that need further consideration. We don't suppose that we are experts in all of the myriad combinations of operations and activities that all of industry engages in. So this workshop very much is about tell us about how these things happen if they do. We've heard one or two examples of how most of these setups work, but again, we need to know more about how this sort of thing happens, where or if. Maybe it is just limited to one or two unique situations, or it might be widespread all over the place. We just, we need some feedback from you all to know a little bit more about the scope and diversity of these kinds of combined multiple operations. So I don't know if you happen to have any other examples that you could share with us, or if we've covered them adequately.
Well, I think one thing that I'd like to focus in on is making sure it's understood that if a processor and end user receives recovered material off-site, processes it at a location, and then uses it as an end user to create a product on site, but it is sold and removed off site. I want to make sure, I hope there is a major distinction between using it on site to make a product that will be sold and removed, as opposed to making a product on site and leaving it on site.
Gosh, I'm not sure. So the overall structure is that a processor that creates an end product, which again needs a little more tweaking, but if you make an end product and you send it to an end user, you have to report that. The end user now takes this end product and turns it into something else. We keep going back to plastics because it's fairly easy for folks to sort of wrap their heads around. So if I make plastic pellets, PET pellets, say, and I send them to a bottle blower, right? I have to report that I sent PET pellets to a bottle blower because the end product is the pellets. The end user is the bottle blower. The bottle blower now has no reporting obligation to CalRecycle. They don't have to tell us how many bottles they make. They don't have to tell us who they sold them to. They don't have to tell us what they did with them. If they fill them with water or Pepsi, or if they fill them themselves or sell them to Pepsi and Pepsi fills them someplace else, no business of ours. We don't care about it. None of that is reportable. But the selling of the pellets to the bottle blower is a reportable flow, even if I make the pellets and blow the bottles on the same site. I only say I sent plastic pellets for end use on site. If I'm the bottle blower and I'm the pellet producer, and I might also chip and grind the bottles myself. I might even wash them all myself. All of the flows in between, if I wash them and chip them and turn them into pellets, all of that would be aggregated. I don't have to tell CalRecycle that, I sent my bottles from my chipping facility, 10 feet away to the pellet machine. All I would say is PET pellets sent for end use on site. So finding sort of how that all plays into the hypothetical that you raised, I'm not sure if that answered your question or if you can give some more details so we can try to figure out how it works. But I think that lays out generally what we're thinking about.
We've already used asphalt being generated on construction sites, streets, or whatever already today. So let's just make sure that we understand using that as an example. So the material is generated off-site on a construction project anywhere. And then it is taken to a site where it is processed, which would mean having it ground, having it crushed, having it screened. And then it is used to make asphalt as an end product. And then it's sold and removed from the site, maybe even back to the job site it originally came or went somewhere else. Okay, so we pretty much understand that.
Right.
Okay, can I use one more example, please?
Please.
Our clients and folks in the construction material business also do a lot of recycling of broken concrete and broken asphalt that does not go into asphalt or concrete ready mix. However, it is generated off-site from construction site. It is taken to a site where that recovered material is processed by an end user, making specified products that meet specifications, either Caltrans specifications or the Green Book specifications. So they have processed that material on site. They have made an end use product. They enter the end user. Then they sell that product and it is taken off site and goes to a job site.
So I would say that they are not the end user, that they create an end product and the job site that it's sent to is the end user.
How would that be different from the asphalt example? They're both construction materials that are meeting specifications, either Caltrans or Green Book. Yeah,
so I think the difference is that the material in the asphalt example it's crushed and it's graded or however it's processed, and then the asphalt process uses that recycled material, so that crushed asphalt comes in as a feedstock to the asphalt process and is mixed in with binding agents and other materials and ingredients to make their product. So the end use of the crushed asphalt is the asphalt manufacturer. On the other example, you're crushing asphalt and or concrete, so you're creating the end product, which is this crushed rubble of various specs, and you send it to an end user who uses it not mixed into asphalt with binding agents, etc., but instead they put it behind a retaining wall, or they put it under a road, or they put it under a foundation, or what have you. And so in that situation, the actual end user, whether it's a construction company or the civil engineering firm or whoever it is that's taking the crushed material, that end product, and using it someplace, is the end user.
Well, I disagree.
Can I just say that the only difference in your reporting would be that for the one stream, you'd say I processed this much asphalt for end use on site, and for the other example, you'd say I sent this much to end users off site. So the reporting requirement isn't different. Whether it's the end use is on site or off site, you would just say one end use is on site and another is not. And then you would tell us, depending on the amount that you send out, who it was sent to.
Well, the two examples that we're talking about, asphalt is introduced, that is wrap that's been recovered, crushed, screened, and then added to virgin material. That is a little bit different than the other example. However, in recycling construction materials, like let's say base material, you are utilizing 100% recovered material and not adding any virgin material, okay? So think about this, using Tykert as an example. They are doing the asphalt, we all understand that. They also have a recycling center on site, and they're bringing in broken concrete and broken asphalt, both to specification. They take it and put the construction recycled broken concrete and asphalt as a base material. They're putting that on the ground first, and then right after that, they're bringing asphalt, putting it right on top. So how is that different?
So I think it's also worth going back to what Ilanka said. In the example of the asphalt, your reporting obligation would be CalRecycle. I sent off 1,000 tons of recycled asphalt to an end use on site because the end user is my asphalt plant and it's on the same site as the processing plant, right? On the other example, you either report I sent out 1,000 tons of crushed concrete to an end user off site, or you report I sent 1,000 tons of crushed concrete to an end user on site. Those are really the two options that we're debating here. Whether you're the end user or not, the reporting obligation is not terribly different. It's a small distinction, but perhaps one that is important. And if it is, then maybe we need to continue talking. But there won't. I don't think we get to a point where you take concrete and crush it and sell it to construction companies, and that whole process has zero reporting obligations.
I think the issue here is actually what is a manufacturing process and what is a suitable raw material to go into your manufacturing process. And in the case of a Tykert, they are manufacturing when they make road base. They make road base from virgin material. They make road base from recycled concrete. It is a manufactured product that they then sell into the marketplace, just like the asphalt is a manufactured product. So the real issue is when is it a raw material suitable for use in the manufacturing process that's entering into the stream of commerce?
Right,
and the end user is the manufacturer, as you have been describing it.
Right.
And I think what we're debating here with rock, well, you don't view it as a product. It is a highly engineered specification that must meet engineering specs for use. So when you are taking a concrete to use as road base, it will be in this specification so it compacts in this way.
Right.
That is a manufactured product. So where is the line between the recycling to a raw material that's suitable for use in your manufacturing process? And plastic pellets for a bottle is easy. In these raw materials, I think dirt's a good example of this too. People take dirt off site, say clean dirt. They may add things to it before they use it for a fill somewhere else, but it was still a suitable raw material at the point it was removed. So if they are taking in a raw material that was processed and sorted at the construction site, that's really potentially the processing area. And what the companies are receiving is a raw material suitable for their normal manufacturing process.
Right. So just so we get on the same page with terminology, what we're talking about here is end product and end user. So the end user uses the end product, and the end product, as we're defining things, and as you say, it's a little tricky. Some areas it's rather straightforward and easy to lay out, and others it's not so much. But what we're essentially looking at is when a material is processed to a degree that it essentially resembles its virgin counterpart. And we know that this is not a perfect definition yet, but so in the example of crushed concrete, if you didn't have crushed concrete available, you might use crushed rock, correct? Yeah. You wouldn't use boulders, right? You would use the boulders after they've been crushed into a particular size.
The construction material supply is a local marketplace. So if you are indeed in the mountains where all you have is hard rock, it is very possible that you will be making small rocks from big rocks in that hard rock operation to provide the local materials, because the environmental impacts of shipping this material any significant distance along with the cost is simply untenable. Now, if you're looking at the California marketplace, we have broad alluvial valleys, and a lot of our aggregate is from these alluvial deposits where nature has done a lot of that breaking for us. But it is not necessarily true that you won't be breaking big rocks into small rocks to provide construction materials.
Right, but you would at that point be, so if I'm a construction company and I'm building a road, I would buy crushed rock, correct? Rather than large rocks and breaking them myself. Somebody else would break them and size them and screen them and sell them as a material for me to use as a construction material, correct?
And in this marketplace, there are companies that are vertically integrated that have the mines that crush the rock,
Right.
that place it on the ground. Tykert being an example of a vertically integrated company that has mines,
Right.
has construction
So these
divisions.
would be multiple activities. They just happen to all be owned by the same company.
Well, but the manufacturing of the rock is a manufacturing process, I think is the point. Even if you're taking an alluvial deposit, you're processing it, and that's manufacturing.
Yeah.
So when the feedstock is coming from a recycled stock, that's when we would get involved and would want that information. So yes, there's a difference between a finished product that you would put on the road, and I think the point at which it becomes that is when you crush it to the spec, right? So then you have the end product, which you tell us you sent to an end use when it comes from the recycled material.
Right. So in our estimation, what we're looking at is in concrete, it becomes an end product when it's been crushed, graded, screened, whatever, and it meets these specs, whatever size and specs that it has. That's the end product, right? So you've got a pile of crushed concrete. The rebar has been removed. The other stuff has been removed. It's been broken into reasonably sized pieces for use in some particular purpose, whether it's under a road or whatever. So that's the end product as we're looking at it now. How does it get to be that end product? Somebody pulls it out off of the ground somewhere, right? And they break it up and they pull the scrap metal out and they screen it and make it. So if that's the end product, who uses that material? Who's the person you send it to as an end product to use it? If it's being crushed on the construction site and graded and screened and sorted into different trucks and shipped off to a holding yard, maybe that's the shipment from processor, the construction company who pulled it off of the ground and broke it up and screened it, to the end user. But if it goes in huge blocks with the rebar still in it to the yard, and the yard then breaks it up and pulls the rebar out and screens it and separates it and makes sure it meets the specs for use in construction, then that's the processing step. And when they send it off to a construction company or whoever they send it to, the receiving entity of that end product, the screened, crushed, separated, sorted rubble, rock, aggregate, whatever we call it, is the end user. So is that not right?
Well, I want to step in a little bit as well. I think the definition, we're hitting on this discussion because the definition of end use and end user is a key piece of this. And I think there are arguments to be made. I mean, I understand your specification, you do it to spec, it's a product. I understand that argument, and it's something we'll certainly discuss. And to broaden that out a little bit, for every single material, plastic or paper or other things, they'll go through various steps. And I'd like to hear from folks in each of those industries in written comments or an oral testimony or anything else, where it is in that step that it becomes a final product. And hear the arguments about, well, no, it should be, after this step or before this step, or, when it's just in a bale that's mixed with everything else, no. But then when it's paper pulp, well, what else are you going to use it for? So that's a product. Or, for each of these, like with plastics, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, how far down the stream do you go? Because there are a lot of intermediate steps on a lot of these things. So it's certainly something we want to hear about and hear your discussion on, because we don't want to be going, like a good example yesterday was we were talking about mulch. And it's like, we don't want to have Home Depot reporting every bag of mulch that they sell. The bagger might be the end user, and then the composter would be reporting, or the chip and grind facility would be reporting that they sent it to the end user, who's the bagger. There's some parallels there with, well, the chip and grind material has to meet certain specs, and that's what goes out. And aggregate doesn't get bagged, but it's used different ways. So it's like, let's hear some of this discussion, and we have, when we do the next round of regulations, I think we have some thinking to do for each of the material sets that we're looking at.
And just before, I'll ask another question, because I'd like you to respond to that, but this as well. We're hearing a lot of sort of, this is the end use and therefore should not be a reporter for this particular situation. But could you identify for me who you believe is the processor who should be the reporting entity for this example of concrete being crushed in size for rubble, so that we understand where you think that level of, where the processor is in this stream of recycling for concrete, so that we understand from your perspective where it should be?
For example, on Tiger scenario, we will be the processor of material that comes, on site. Like it could be broken asphalt or broken rice recycle. The problem that we are afraid is that on the reporting side, and by not reporting correctly, you get fines, and that's what the problem is. It will be very hard for us to know exactly where the material comes from, okay, and where the material goes to.
So first, to dispel the first concern, if you're engaged in a recycling operation, so you don't need to report anything about where the material came from. No jurisdiction of origin. You literally don't have to tell us anything about what comes into your facility. We don't need to know how much. We don't need to know what it was. We don't need to know where it came from. We need to know only what left your facility. So 1,000 tons of concrete to an end user, or 100 tons of asphalt to some other processor, or 1,000 tons of steel rebar to a recycler, and that's it. The only time that you have to know anything about where the material came from as a recycling operator is if you fall into the category of needing to report jurisdiction of origin for the amount that goes to a landfill. And for the most part, most facilities that are recycling are not going to have that reporting obligation. It's really only meant for MRFs and transfer stations that send a large portion of the material that they get to a landfill. So hopefully that dispelled some of your concern about the first part, about not knowing where it came from exactly, because you don't have to report anything about that. On the other side of things, you would need to report what left your facility, what you sold or sent out or used as your product. But our understanding is that most companies that are selling material have a pretty decent understanding of what they've sold, because it's obviously part of their their main profit-generating activity. So you know if you've sold steel or if you've sold concrete or if you've sent material to another facility for processing. So I don't know if that helps, if that answered your concerns or questions.
Yeah, that helps to understand, exactly what needs to be reported. What will be the accuracy, in tons?
Yeah.
Because, for example, just giving you an idea, in a bad year, Tiger will sell maybe 6 million tons. So, what's the accuracy that we need to, pinpoint? Because when you receive asphalt and when you receive recycle, you cannot, send it back out as 100% that product. It's just a small portion of, brand new asphalt. Brand new asphalt, the only thing is little rocks, big rocks made into little rocks of different size, mix it up with oil. So, when asphalt comes into our facility, we crush it so it can be mixed again and heat up to 250 degrees. That's the trick of asphalt.
Yeah, so all you would report is how many tons of asphalt did you crush up and put into mix?
Okay.
You wouldn't have to tell us what percentage went in. You wouldn't have to tell us how much total finished asphalt was made out of it. Just how many tons of crushed asphalt you sent to be mixed into new asphalt.
Okay.
That's the end of it.
And
other things came out too. I mean, if you were separating out steel or other materials that came out that couldn't be mixed in, and maybe some amount of it had to be, sent off for recycling elsewhere.
And concrete will be the same. Just report how much concrete we process.
Yeah, that's exactly right. How much left your facility as something. As crushed, even if you sent it off in whole chunks to somebody else to crush, you would just report tons of concrete sent to this other facility for processing. They would then have to report what they did if they're a reporting entity.
Okay.
Yeah, so recyclers and composters have to basically report 4 things. One is material that was sent for residual disposal, material that was sent to an end user, material that was sent, exported out of state would be another one. And then the last one is material that was sent to other facilities for more processing.
We've got a question over here, but Larry's been waiting for a while, so we'll go to Larry and then we'll come back over to this side.
I was actually first going to go back to an earlier answer to a question, but before I did that, I wanted to add to the confusion of this one. I'm not sure what site means. That might need a definition, because the examples I'm thinking of is you may have on one property a landfill or a compost facility or a MRF or a recycling center, some of which may have separate permits, some of them may not, and if material flows in between those. You may have asphalt that you get at the recycling center part, which may or may not have its own permit, that gets crushed there and then brought to the landfill to be used as road base. You may have composting that you use for other material. At this point, I have no clue who has to report what to where.
Yeah, so, and I'll address that before we move on to your second point. We agree that we need more definition on this concept of what constitutes a single site. However, regardless of how we define it, flows between a recycling and or composting facility as one side of things and a disposal facility always have to be reported, even if they're 10 feet from each other. So there's no aggregated reporting between a recycling facility and a disposal facility, regardless of how closely they're associated with one another. There is the provision to allow for aggregated reporting between, say, a chip and grind in a compost facility, or between a MRF and an on-site recycling facility, or one sorting facility and then another processing facility for recycling. But exactly how far away they can still be and still be considered one site, we haven't completely decided, but generally speaking, it's, if you can reasonably look at it and say, yes, that's the same site, That is basically what we're looking to do, not really associated with permit conditions or anything like that. But if obviously you've got a sorting facility and 5 miles away you've got a processing facility, those are not on the same site. Those are separate sites. So even if they're owned by the same company, they would have to report the flows between them.
So if I get a bunch of pallets at my green processing area of a site, and I take those to use them somewhere else, like at a transfer station, I would have to report that to myself.
Are you using them or are you recycling them?
Using them.
You don't have to report reuse.
Or if you're going to recycle them, then.
If you were going to break them apart and recycle them, that maybe they were going to go into some other use, then if both of those facilities or those operations are on the same site, you don't have to report that. But if you collect pallets at one facility, you drive them across town, another facility where they go into a grinder, then that flow would have to be reported.
Which I guess goes back to my question on the earlier question from Carlos about the household hazardous waste facility at a transfer station. There may be pallets that flow from the transfer station into the facility, or buckets, or even recycled paint that they may do on site gets taken over to reuse to paint the wall.
All of the reuse has no reporting obligation whatsoever. So if you're sending stuff off-site for reuse, there's no reporting. If you're using it on-site for reuse, there's no reporting. If you're selling it to somebody for reuse, there's no reporting.
So if the household facility has some empty containers, which they all do, and takes it next door to the landfill or the transfer station, they'd have to report that because it's disposal?
If they take it for disposal, they have to report it. Yep. If they take it to a recycling operation that is on the same site, then they don't have to report it. But if they take it across town to some other recycling entity, then they do. Right, sorry. So we had a hand over here from earlier, and then we'll jump over to the other side.
Natalie Hicks, Waste Connections. What about a landfill that receives wood waste that is then chipped and ground and used on site? Whose responsibility is reporting the wood waste?
You receive wood waste as a disposal facility, right?
Correct.
So your landfill, and you're going to use it on site for beneficial reuse.
Correct.
Yeah, the landfill reports as beneficial reuse. So the landfill has an obligation to report all of the disposal and all of the on-site beneficial reuse.
Okay.
For obligation to report that. And then let's go over here in the middle, and then Brian, and I don't know if there's another hand, but we'll get to those.
Tim Dumatia again, Napa Recycling Waste Services. A couple of examples of material moving between MRFs, because it's actually pretty common. One of them is Jennifer here works for one of our partner companies in Paradise, and they have kind of an intermediary facility where they accept single stream recycling and then put on transfer trucks and bring it to our facility in Napa. They also process other source-separated recyclables and then sell those. So how do we make sure we report those tons only once, and then, and who's doing the reporting? And the other thing is a lot of single-stream recyclables, mixed plastics, materials move between MRFs for sorting. So like, for instance, we would send our MRF residuals to another MRF to be sorted. Happens a lot. And how does that material get captured? Currently, when we're reporting to jurisdictions, we're reporting that as recycled. But how do we make sure that that's reported or not reported and then not double counted?
Okay, a couple of things. So if you're sending material from one MRF to another MRF, and those two MRFs are not located at the same place, they're not on the same site, which I imagine they're not, then you would simply report that you sent whatever it is, if it's mixed recyclables or if it's pre-sorted and some of it's, mixed paper or mixed plastic or whatever, you would report that you sent some amount of material to another facility. And then that facility would report however many tons of material they sent on to some other facility. And to get to your question about the double counting, it will be double counted. It will be triple and quadruple counted as well. The purpose of 901 reporting is not to sort of get a grand total of the sum of all materials in the state and subtract out all the sort of inter-transport between facilities. It's actually I think just the opposite. We want to understand all of those little transfers and really truly know where material is flowing and how the system works. And if all we know is that material was collected in the city of Napa and it ultimately made its way to a processing facility in San Jose, that doesn't tell us much if it took a route through Shasta County and then down into Bakersfield and then over to San Francisco and ultimately down to San Jose for its final processing route. So we want to know all the steps. And then your question about how would you report sending residuals off to another sorting facility, another MRF who's going to be able to further sort your residuals. You would, we're trying to build in a material category that would essentially, depending on the nature of those residuals, you would identify them as mixed recyclables or mixed solid waste sent for recycling to another facility. So you're sending mixed solid waste to a MRF for recycling, and that would be it. And if you were sending some of those residuals to a landfill, you would say, and I'm sending Y tons of mixed solid waste to disposal at landfill A, B, or C. And then, you know, the receiving MRF is now on the hook for just saying what they do. You know, I sent out X number of tons of PET and this amount of aluminum and this amount of paper, and I sent this amount of residuals, i.e. mixed solid waste, to landfill X.
And I guess because you just said earlier, if you're receiving recyclables, you're not reporting on origin anyway. So you're just saying you brought in X tons and sent off these
Wouldn't
things.
even say you brought in X.
You don't even say anything, right? It's just all about what we
It's
offset.
only about what left. You only tell us what you sent and what it was, how much of it, and where it went.
And that's going to let us do a few things. You know, with the 4 categories that I keep coming back to for recyclers and composters is the amount sent to end use. All right, that material is leaving the system. So we'll have a total for that. That's a good thing. The amount exported out of state, it's important to know how much is being exported out of state. That's an end use that's leaving the system again. Residual sent for disposal. All right, that's going into a hole, it's being buried, that's leaving the system. Those are all counts that aren't double counting. The material that goes to other facilities is that's the area where we're not going to add up all those totals and say, wow, you know, that's a tremendously huge number. But getting those final destinations and then getting the information on flows in between facilities is really what we're looking to do.
Thank you, John. We got Brian. We got some folks online, and we are getting towards the end. So we'll start to close down. But go ahead, Brian.
So let me just understand. You're saying that a recycling facility does not have to report jurisdiction of origin of materials coming in, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So, but they do have to report jurisdiction of origin to a disposal facility for any residuals that they produce.
Yes, only if they are producing large amounts of residuals.
So that means they have to collect jurisdiction of origin material coming in.
They have to collect it. They don't have to report it. They don't have to report to us the jurisdiction of origin on all the material that comes in. They only have to report to us the jurisdiction of origin for the large amounts of residuals leaving their facility going to a disposal facility, which may not necessarily be the same breakdown as what's coming into their facility.
Let me give you an example. We have Davis Street Transfer Station. It has a single stream MRF there. It also has a self-haul MRF there. Glass comes in on the single stream line from multiple jurisdictions, both in and out of the county. They process the glass, send it over to Strategic Materials, which is a recycling facility. They receive the stuff from Davis Street and multiple other MRFs. They process the glass, beneficiate the glass, and then send out a significant amount of tonnage that ends up going to disposal. They have to more than 10% per the regulation here. If they don't get the material, if they don't get the information from Davis Street of where the incoming material comes from, they're not going to be able to give a jurisdiction of origin to the disposal material. So that's a pretty complicated little puzzle we're creating here. And I also think of the pallet yard. You get pallets coming in from everywhere. He pulls pallets apart, makes new pallets. Now, that piece of wood that he used from an old pallet is part of your asphalt situation here. He sells those pallets to an end user. He sends wood to a chip and grind operation. Is he a recycler? Is he a processor? Where is he in the system?
He's probably the pallet user is probably just a reuser. I don't know that they would fall into the category of a recycler. So if
Chip
they're-
and grind and send pallets either to particle board or to cogen
So if
or
they're
to
chipping-
colorized mulch
if they're
or
grinding pallets rather than just rebuilding or refurbishing them,
they're doing both.
so so they have different things, all right? So their operations related to rebuilding pallets have nothing to do with 901. Their operations related to chipping pallets and sending it off for particle board or what have you is recycling, and therefore that operation, those activities are reportable under 901.
You don't have to report jurisdiction of origin because it's recycling.
Right. The jurisdiction of origin would only come into place if they're sending more than 10% of what their total outbound quantities are to a landfill. And there are, some of these unique situations where material is moving with large amounts of contamination through the process, and you end up with somebody 2 or 3 steps down the road with all of a sudden a huge amount of residuals. Ultimately, I think we'll have to rethink a little bit about how to do this. We go back oftentimes to what our intent is. Somebody who's engaged in the business of taking glass and melting it and turning it into either new bottles or fiberglass or whatever, they're going to produce some waste, right? Everybody does. Everybody who operates any kind of business produces waste. But we don't want them to have the burden of tracking all the way back to jurisdiction of origin. But if 50, 60, 70% of what is coming through their facility is garbage, then that's a significant flow of solid waste through the system that we don't want to lose where it came from, just because people are sending it and sort of tagging it, quote unquote, as, well, this is glass for recycling, but it's 70% solid waste for disposal.
Or 12%. So it's above the threshold for what you're saying is required. It's not 75%. I mean, strategic wouldn't take that kind of load, but they are taking loads that are 15, 20% solid waste, and they also have glass that goes through their process and ends up with their residual stream. And so they're not able to separate all the product, all the contamination from the product that they're recovering.
Right.
And so part of it, what they're shipping out is not bottle caps and corks and lids and things like that. It's glass fines that didn't make it through the process.
Okay, so I'm gonna just kind of say one more thing on this, and then we'll move on to another question online, and then we'll close things out. But what I'm hearing is that you think that those kinds of operations should not have to report jurisdiction of origin for their residuals. And in order to accomplish that, we would have to change the threshold that we currently have at 10% to potentially some higher number, so that operations like that you think shouldn't have to report jurisdiction of origin for their residuals, in fact don't. And so if we decide that that's the path we want to go, understanding, if it's not 10, should it be 12 or 15 or 18, or where's that number that excludes the people that people think shouldn't have to report that kind of information. So
Yeah.
With that being said, I'd like...
And we don't want, recyclers to have to track jurisdiction of origin and then decide each quarter, do I have to report it? These guys should be out. I mean, the jurisdiction of origin piece on this should be MRFs and transfer stations, and basically anybody who takes segregated materials And cleaner materials shouldn't have to ask about jurisdiction of origin, shouldn't have to keep track of it, shouldn't have to report it. What we're trying to address here, and we talked about it a little bit in the thresholds one yesterday, was people who are taking extremely dirty material basically to get around the system or to make waste disappear. And those are the things that we're trying to identify. And that's maybe not an issue, but talk to us about what those levels would be, about what's reasonable, because our intent is to exclude folks who are taking primarily clean material and doing what they're supposed to do with it. So we don't want recyclers to have to track the jurisdiction of origin stuff. So talk to us about how to make that happen.
We've got one online. I want to make sure that we're being fair to the people who are online. So Alonka, could you read one of the questions? And then we're going to try to close. I know Larry's got a pressing question. But.
If I, as a hauler, collect food waste and process it to send it to a wastewater treatment plant for AD, do I need to report this separately?
So I would say probably yes. If you're processing material, if you're processing food waste, then you would be a reporting entity for reporting the processing and wherever you end up taking the processed food waste, whether it be AD or to composting or any other end use or further processing stage. So
One more.
Okay, go ahead.
Will electronic waste or hazardous waste collection events that are held at various sites for a single day have their own reporting requirements, or will that activity get aggregated with the event host activity at their permanent site?
I would imagine that those would, if we end up with materials on the list as they currently are that fall under the category of hazardous waste, or that they have these sort of remote collection opportunities like tires do, like e-waste does, like some of the other HHW materials do, that they would be wrapped up under the sort of the host organization that is running the event. We're going to take Larry, and then I want to close with some final thoughts and next step. Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Neil, go ahead.
You wanted some feedback on the bullet points you have up there, so I'll walk you through quickly scenarios. So we permit facilities. We permit an agricultural composting facility at a large agricultural concern owns, and they originally started out as generating, processing, and using all the material on site. It was so successful in helping them their production that they started taking the material they were producing to other properties that they own. So now we're saying at that point, it's being shipped off-site. So if it's a self-contained entity as an agricultural composting operation, is that being considered as something that needs to report? And then once they start transporting material to other property off-site that they own, that clearly seems to qualify as a reporting entity.
Yeah, I don't know that we talked specifically about that kind of a situation, but it seems like, if they're sending it, if they're generating and processing on site and sending it off, even if it's to another site that they happen to own, that would still constitute a reportable transfer. But again, we're open to thoughts if people think that's not something that should be reported.
So then the facility is growing and it's a benefit to the operations. They start taking feedstocks from local curbside collection programs and composting it, and then distributing it out onto their own properties and to other properties that they own. They've started screening some of the material, and they were at one point sending woody materials to biomass. That market is almost completely gone now, and as we talked about yesterday, I think categorizing wood waste is a separate issue we can talk about later today. Some of the material is going to local landfill and being used for ADC. So right now that's considered recycling. When in 2020, when that material is no longer considered recycling, it's considered disposal, who reports what, and how does that change when the recycling credits are no longer there?
Yeah, so I think even the sending material to a landfill for ADC would be reported as material sent to a disposal facility, because the landfill is a disposal facility. Some of what they do with the material is they dispose it. Some of what they do is they use it for engineering projects on site, and some of what they do is use it for ADC or AIC. They could also send it off to another facility that wants it, a compost facility or an anaerobic digester or a biomass facility or whoever in the world that wants it. So you, as a chip and grind facility that's sending it to the landfill, you have no way of knowing whether they're going to use it for ADC or if they're going to just dump it in the landfill because they don't have any capacity to use it as ADC, or if they're going to sell it to a compost facility. So you say you sent it to a disposal facility, and then you're done. The disposal facility now has to tell us what they do with the material. They have to tell us what they landfill versus what they use for beneficial reuse, and how, and what they send if they send material off for recycling or composting. How things will be characterized later, and whether the jurisdiction gets credit for material used for ADC for diversion versus disposal, that's a discussion for some other group and at another time. This is just reporting what you did with it. Which box it falls into is really outside the scope of 901. We just report the flows, what it was, where it went, etc. And then things can be shuffled as much as they need to be later on through other policy efforts elsewhere within CalRecycle or otherwise. And those might change, but I don't think we'll have any bearing on 901 reporting. We'll end with Larry, so make it good.
The last word. That earlier example about the processing on the glass that was mentioned, I'm not sure if I'm ready to give up on county jurisdiction of origin, because the scenario I can think of is if that facility, 11, 10%, or even less than 10%, which would get them out of a permit, if that facility is located like in a rural area, that rural jurisdiction will get attributed 100% of that residual, which 10,000 tons could easily come out of that facility, which would be a significant amount of material for a small community. So they would be stuck with that tonnage, and all we could say is we don't know. I mean, I think with that, there may need to be needs to track that in some situations.
Okay, thank you. We'll make another quick one, and then we'll finish up. And we can continue conversation offline, and certainly other workshops later today and tomorrow. I'm sure we'll touch on similar issues.
Yeah, just to add to his, is that similar to the biosolids market, which we discussed a little bit yesterday and today.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you. Really briefly, so that folks can get out for lunch, we're going to finish up our workshops today and tomorrow. We'll take all the questions received during the workshops. We're asking for written comments to be submitted by September 12th, and we're hoping to get a revised draft out sometime in October. If all goes well and things are looking good, we're hoping to start the formal regulatory process towards the end of October. As we said, we're shooting for that fall timeline for beginning the formal rulemaking process. Contact information, you've seen it before. You can find me or the AB 901 mailbox. And then get on the listserv if you're not already on it, so that you don't miss future workshops, meetings, or draft language when it comes out. For those folks who are on the webinar, if you're listening in on later workshops, you'll have to click in on another link. So make sure you've signed up for each of the workshops you're interested in. For the folks here in person, we'll be back in this room after our lunch break. So we'll be back at 1. Thanks, everyone.
And as usual, my plea is send us comments, send us specifics, identify the things that are going to give you the most heartburn, give us solutions about how to fix that in these regs. This is really the time where we can make the changes in the regulations the easiest and be the most responsive to comments. So tell us about it.